Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 2.
Chapter 14.
Apologies, Rex. As you can see, the debriefing had to wait, Ahsoka said, walking up to her oldest friend as he surveyed the departing ships. I have a bad feeling about that mission, Ahsoka. Corey is pretty rough space, Rex said in return, lost in his thoughts as he stared up at the departing shuttle. Ahsoka followed his gaze as the shuttle engaged its maneuvering jets to align itself with Ravda's gravity well, then watched as the ion engines flared to life just before it sped away and out of sight. I have a feeling we're headed toward a similar fate, she offered in return, doing little to give hope to the clone's remark. Rex brought his gaze down to meet her, crossing his arms before his chest. There was no sign of Quinlan Voss, Ahsoka. Sander mentioned as much before arriving. He said with a chortled laugh, I suppose there is some irony in an ex-Republic clone trooper and a former ISB agent asking local populace about a Jedi's whereabouts. Ahsoka found it impossible to hold in her laugh. We did mention that before you two departed, if you remember, she added with a wink. Her expression turned more serious and she continued, We will see what becomes of our attempt. I still believe you sent the right message to those who would conceal the path, which is important. She said with an air of finality expressing outwardly an innate satisfaction, inwardly wishing the venture had succeeded. We will try again, Rex. We cannot lose sight of hope. Rex sighed slightly, trying to keep from asking the question nagging him. What of Bridger? He brought himself to say, not surprising Ahsoka one bit. Still nothing, she said, blowing out a breath. These things take time, however. She finished, recovering from her perceived downcast remark. On multiple occasions, she had reached out through the Force to sense his presence without anything to speak of for the attempts. As you said, Ahsoka, we cannot lose sight of hope. He repeated her words, clasping a strong hand on her shoulder. His gesture was a clear sign of his unwavering loyalty and commitment. Which reminds me, he said with a glance to her side, Ahsoka turning to see Sabine, Kallus, and Kawani approaching them. You know the impossibility of reaching young Ezra, Ahsoka. Why delude their hopes? Zard asked, breaking the silence that had settled between the two for some time. Because I believe there is hope still. Ahsoka thought in return to the spirit of the Zeltran that resided within her conscience. The galaxy is a vast place, Zar, she reminded him. We both know he does not reside within this galaxy if he yet lives, Ahsoka. He returned, speaking through the lens of realism. She did not respond, knowing full well that he was right. Ahsoka? Sabine asked again, pulling her attention back out of her mind. Yes, sorry, go ahead, she said to the small semicircle of friends around her, then Dali even residing in a small projection of herself in Kawani's hand. Alexander, if you would continue, and Dali spoke directly to the matter at hand. Yes, what we didn't find on the Debaric pales compared to what we did find, he said, proffering a datapad that elicited whistles of approval from old and new Mandalorians, as they crammed together to scan the contents of the find simultaneously. And Dali, we've sent you the manifest as well. As we haven't the ability to transport any of this, we were hoping you could find a solution. The quartet waited in silence, as they watched the tiny form in Kawani's hand analyze the manifest. Ahsoka leaning over to view what they were all looking at. She elicited a short but severe inhale while scanning the datapad screen. This is all in one place? Ahsoka asked with an unintentional rise in pitch. It is, Kallus responded. However, we cannot move it. I don't know what the entirety of the Rebel fleet has the capability, Sandar. Indali added. This will take some time, but I'll see what I can do. 14 TX-130 Sabers, 10 Meekum trackers, CAC freerunners, Ahsoka rattled off the first few entries. 9 intact. Parts for another 2 or 3 operable, Kallus added. 16 AT-AP? Ahsoka trailed off immediately after picking up where she had left off. There are also countless scout bikes of various make and design, munitions for all the heaven weaponry, A380 blaster rifles, mag mines for the sabers, and look what the trackers are armed with, Rex added for everyone's benefit. Ion disruptors, Ahsoka questioned. MK2E, Ahsoka, second generation. These things were designed to drop Imperial walkers. As we've stated, getting them off-world is the issue, Rex continued. I might add manpower to use them, Kawani chimed in, though she knew Imdali was already ahead of her with a counter-argument. Ahsoka dropped the pad to her side and turned her head to stare at Rex and Kallus. How exactly did you find this cache? She asked, lifting an eyebrow. She noticed a short glance from Callus to Rex as the old clone cleared his throat. Well, one of the individuals we spoke to regarding Voss had a hard time keeping his lies straight, Rex began. A Celestin, Callus clarified. Yes, Sander, a Celestin, thank you. And we followed him directly to the armory where we found Albus. We believe that, although he didn't trust us regarding the Jedi, he did, or they had agreed to assist the cause somehow. Rex winced briefly, knowing how ridiculous it sounded. Ahsoka understood the facial expression and rested a gentle hand on her old friend's shoulder. Perhaps you are right, and if so, a return trip may solve both issues. Alexander Callus swung his gaze through everyone before deciding to ask the question he knew he wasn't the only one thinking. Do we notify Rebel Command? Kawani was the first to blow out her breath in exasperation, so they can discuss how best not to use it. Besides, we don't technically own it, do we? Someone else is clearly amassing a force for purposes outside our knowledge. Ahsoka couldn't hide her pride upon hearing Kawani utter the words. The woman was right on all counts, but more than that, she displayed, yet again, the values the Mirialan often live by. Well stated, Annie. Until we can gather more information, I think it best to see how things play out, she said. We did notice heavy carbon scoring on the Meekins, Callus said, lifting a hand to stroke his thickened beard. Rex immediately began nodding. It looked recent, too. Those things have seen some heavy action, Ahsoka, he added quickly to follow up. Ahsoka noted the grave, almost coarse tone in her old friend's voice. She focused her eyes on the aging clone trooper, noting how the corners of his eyes were more downturned, almost saddened-looking. At once, Kawani turned away from the group, palming the side of her helmet. Check again, I need you to be sure, the rest heard her say. What is it, Annie? Sabine asked. Kawani dropped her hand and turned back to face them. You've been tracked. Rex and Callus looked at one another in wonderment, then swiveled to face the Liberator. Now, not the ship, Kawani said, walking toward Ahsoka, offering a hand toward the datapad at her side. This, she said, taking the item from the Togruta. I've had R3 on continuous scan since Nar Shaddaa. Trailing off as her comment reminded her of the narrow escape from the Nalhutta moon. Ahsoka looked at Rex. Was there any time this wasn't in our possession? She asked, offering up the datapad. Callus smacked a palm into his forehead. The Celestin. Rex spun on his heels, staring at the sky with his hands on his hips. A Celestin. This Celestin sounds more intriguing by the second, Sabine offered. Freebo Tam, if that's even his real name, Callus added, berating himself. Ahsoka adopted a thoughtful expression, piecing together the duo's time on Deborah. She closed her eyes briefly and opened herself to the Force fully. I don't sense any sinister motives, so this may align with our earlier estimate that whatever group he represents is simply trying to assess whether they get involved. Sounds logical, but probably best to leave here and discuss this off-planet, Sabine said, entertaining sound logic herself. Ahsoka pinched her eyes as an idea began to take shape. Spinning toward Kawani, Annie, would you mind letting me Master Windu's saber? She whispered into the Mirialan's ear. Kawani turned her head to face Ahsoka, looking deep into the Togruta's eyes to discern any meaning she could from the odd request. Not at all. What are you thinking? She whispered in return. Breadcrumbs, is all Ahsoka said in return as Kawani reached into her hip pack to retrieve the carefully wrapped saber hilt and place it in Ahsoka's outstretched hand. I'll explain when we're off planet, I promise, Ahsoka said with a smile, returning to face the assembled consortium. Which leads us to them, Callus said, pointing towards Zeb, who was seated with Konda and Bren next to the Phantom. We can't just leave them here. Ahsoka thought about the question, turning slowly to face the two troopers. I suggest Bren accompany you to Lothal. I feel she could be an asset, she said after a few moments, a feeling expressly shared by Miara, without a word passing between them. I need to talk to Konda again. I don't know what he wants to do. Rex lifted his comm to his mouth. Chop, get us warmed up. Ahsoka swung to face him. Rex, we'll need you with us on this one, she said without hesitation, watching his face lit up in genuine surprise. The facial creases that worried her moments before vanished in the blink of an eye. Callus raised an eyebrow, but saw Ahsoka's wink and understood, nodding approvingly. I guess I don't have to grab my gear then, stated Rex, crossing his arms before his chest. You'll be okay without me then? Callus mockingly asked, showing teeth with a wide grin. Rex looked from Ahsoka to Kawani and then back to Callus. I'll be all right. I'm in good hands, he said with a slight laugh while walking toward the man. He reached out his hand to grab Callus's forearm, Callus returning the gesture in a mutual shake of brotherhood. Stay safe, brother, Rex said under his breath, only loud enough for Callus to hear as he slapped the man's shoulder with his free hand. Callus snickered slightly. You do the same, you old fool. In return, the smile diminishing somewhat, he said, Don't do anything stupid, Rex. I mean it. Slapping the old clone on his shoulder, he squeezed it slightly before heading for the Liberator to grab his own gear. Rex couldn't help but feel a slight sense of loss, even though there wasn't any reason for it. He knew it was an irrational feeling, but he had thought it many times before, fellow brothers sharing farewells for the last times. He believed every word he had uttered as his gaze lingered on the departing man. He knew he would be fine at Ahsoka's side, but something else tugged at him nonetheless, a foreboding sense that he wouldn't see Callus again. He shook his head to scramble the thought into non-existence. Anything wrong? Ahsoka asked him. He turned to her, stared into her familiar eyes, and let a slight smile crease his lips. Nothing, Commander. Let's go talk to Chandra. Agreeing, she handed Rex the saber Kawani had given her. Please put this into the pack I'm going to ask you to retrieve for Konda, she said as they walked slowly toward Zeb and the trooper. Looking at the item, Rex returned to stare directly into her eyes and nodded without uttering a word. Sabine threw her arms around Kawani. Just for the record, I'd always wanted a sister. Better when you get to choose who it is. Kawani understood that better than Sabine may ever know. She thought she felt the same after Ndali had beaten her for the 20th consecutive time playing Jarg, through the first weeks on Kino. Although she felt a deep kinship with Sabine and had been adopted into the family after all, she would never forget the promises she and Ndali had made to each other. Promises to remain as blood sisters no matter what may happen, who may come across their paths, even despite differences. Nothing was more substantial than the family she chose. And with that thought fresh, she had to admit that, yes, Sabine understood how deep those bonds ran. Where are you headed anyway? Sabine asked thoughtfully. Kawani had no idea, only looking toward Ahsoka, hoping that Togruta wouldn't suggest meditating once in orbit on that subject. Honestly, I have no idea. After a few moments, she replied, her gaze falling on the saber hilt at Sabine's waist. She was glad the helmet was on as it hid her wits, knowing they were looking into a lead Ahsoka may have encountered in her search for Ezra. She was never sure how much the two shared on that topic, only that Sabine had promised Hera she'd be at her side through the pregnancy. She was certain Ahsoka wouldn't hide anything from Sabine, but would omit it not to contradict her commitments. Kawani thought on that for a fleeting moment, knowing full well she would do the same, and that she had done the same in retrospect. Well, stay safe, sister. We'll get some color on those pauldrons when you get back, Sabine said, letting Kawani off the hook. And although Sabine had her helmet on, Kawani knew she was smiling, just as she was. I will do that, sis, and thank you. Thank you for everything, Kawani said in genuine gratitude. You mean everything to me, Sabine. Sabine removed her helmet and swiped a tear from her cheek. First day you're Mandalorian, and you're getting soft on me, Annie. Sheesh. Kawani tore off her helmet and shared the same tears, wrapping her hands around Sabine as her helmet dropped to the rocky ground at their feet. She held the hug tight for several minutes, squeezing her eyes shut. She felt the surge of camaraderie, compassion, and togetherness. She felt the surge of family. Opening her eyes as her head lay on Sabine's shoulder, she watched Xander and Zeb talking to Bren. Her previous thoughts couldn't have been timed better, as she saw Bren shaking Callus's hand, playfully punching Zeb in the stomach, and head with the duo up into the Phantom. Finally, she thought as assuredly as a new member was just added to the mix. She picked her head up and smiled once more into the face of Sabine as they broke their embrace. Kawani picked up her helmet as Sabine started for the Phantom herself. She paused after a few steps and half turned back to Kawani. Make sure you spar with that saber, Annie, and don't hold back, she said, laughing as she pulled her helmet on and continued her way. Kawani slapped the cool black cylinder clipped to her belt. I'll let her have it, she yelled after her. She chuckled mildly as she turned her gaze again to Ahsoka and Rex, approaching Konda. He won't come, she said as they walked toward the Liberator. Konda saw the two approach and knew precisely what was about to transpire. His mind made up, he had already prepared his response. Before you lay into your recruitment speech, I'll start by saying thank you. he said as both Ahsoka and Rex were within arm's reach. He picked himself off the ground to face them. Thank you for saving me. Us. He paused, back on Trunnion. He could see them working through whatever they had prepared to say, but he raised a finger. I'm going to stay here. Rex looked to Ahsoka, who hadn't taken her eyes off the trooper. He could tell she was falling back to counter-arguments and contingencies, and was quite surprised when she replied. I understand. We'll leave what we can for you, ration packs, survival gear, and such, but I recommend heading for the settlement on the horizon. It's a safe place. Konda wasn't prepared for her response, surprised at the concession. Oh, okay. Thank you. Again, then. Honestly, I thought there was a chance before. I already know that all changed after Tovik. She trailed off. Konda felt ashamed immediately. She had read him like a well-worn book. This Togruta understood his home, knew his people, spoke the language, and had taken the time to learn his name and also knew his thoughts. Rex, reading the path of the conversation, was already turning around to race back to the Liberator to grab the promised items. Ahsoka? Yes? After her slight nod, he continued. Ahsoka, thank you for understanding. I've seen enough of this war. I've seen what it can do to the best of us. He tried continuing, but his emotions got the better of him. After choking back tears he had yet to shed for his fallen comrade, he said, And I've seen enough of Imperial protocols never to look back. Ahsoka adopted a simple grin and nodded toward him, closing her eyes as she placed a hand on his shoulder. The Force will be with you, Konda. Good luck, she said as she opened her eyes and smiled broadly. Rex had already returned with a pack slung over his shoulder. There should be enough in there for a week on your own. Rations, change of clothes, and here, he said, offering a pair of boots. They'll serve you well. Konda took the offered pack and swung it over his shoulder. Take care of yourself, Konda. I hope to see you again one day. Konda nodded his thanks to them both and turned on his heel, heading toward the settlement Ahsoka had mentioned, not once turning back. Ahsoka continued staring after him briefly. You gave him your boots? Rex laughed, doing his best to avoid the bellicose guffaw he was narrowly holding back. He'll get a lot further in life without that lousy armor on, especially those boots. They're hell on the heels. He placed an arm on Ahsoka's shoulder as they stared after Konda's retreating form. Can we get out of here already? Ahsoka was silent momentarily, genuinely hoping the trooper would find some good soon. Something that could help him believe again. Believe in himself, perhaps, or even something greater than himself. Either would be an improvement. Let's go, she said finally. The two turned silently toward the Liberator, Ahsoka gazing at the departing phantom as it swayed slightly, knowing Sabine was servicing her final farewell. Rux stumbled aside after her tripping on something half buried between hard ground and stone. He swiveled to inspect the implement of his near fall and found a rusted, dull blade, several centimeters long, protruding from a limbed crack at his feet. Bending down to pull it from its natural sheath, he struggled momentarily before it released into his meaty hand. Reaping blade from an old thresher, Ahsoka said, startling him as he looked up to see her staring at the item. Returning his gaze to the blade, Rex turned it over several times in his hand, inspecting its edges, the layers of built-up rust and the damaged coupler adorning the opposite end. I'm old, Ahsoka, he said suddenly without taking his eyes off the braid. I'm getting slow, he said, then paused, forgetting things. He continued. She knew this was coming. She had sensed something troubling her old friend for a few months now, and although she still saw him as the old clone captain she had always known and loved, she did have to admit that his former prowess had diminished. Maybe a bit slower, Rex, but we knew that would happen over time. She wasn't quite sure she had phrased that right, but they'd had this discussion before, and she knew he wouldn't accept any placating comments that didn't speak directly to the truth, one that the two had forged over decades of fighting side by side. I didn't ask you to come with us to tell you what I thought you wanted to hear. I know you better than to expect anything of the sort, Ahsoka. He chimed in with a short burst of laughter, and then quickly turned his head down and eyed the blade again, his laugh dying in the air before them. Slow. Slow I can deal with. Forgetting things, letting the obvious slip by my notice, he breathed, can get us killed. Ahsoka slapped an arm around his shoulder, taking the blade from his hand. If this is about Deberick, Callus missed it too. Any of us could have. She twisted the blade in her hand a few times before quickly swishing her wrist and bearing it halfway into the hardened clay beneath. Kicking at it, She removed her arm from his shoulder and bent down to yank it from the ground. With a firm tug, she wrenched it free, leaving several layers of dust behind. And although not shiny by any means, the blade's tip was smooth. Appearances may be deceiving, my friend. She winked at him and threw her arm around his shoulder as they boarded the vessel. It's about time, you two, Kawani scolded them as they finally appeared through the cockpit hatchway, R3 chiming in his derogatory report. Beep boop work? And I thought I was impatient, Kawani answered as she raised a hand to the headset's earpiece she had put on. Copy and dolly and keep us updated. Take care, sis. Love you. She turned back toward Ahsoka and Rex with a slight smile on her lips. And where are we headed? She asked while toggling through her takeoff preparations. The repulsor generator fired to lift with a massive hum. Miss you too, girl, she said to herself as she engaged the ion drives and shot from the planet's surface and out into low orbit. Bravo 2, Ahsoka said casually, causing both Rex and Kawani to face her. Iskalan? Rex beat Kawani to the question. We need supplies, fuel, and time, Ahsoka said, lifting a finger to her chin. Kawani almost forgot her helmet wasn't on, but caught her eye roll in time. And we're meditating, she said to herself as they gently removed the headset and moved to pull herself from the pilot's seat, tapping Rex on the shoulder. Why not just dock with the Challenger while in orbit? Rex asked openly. Ahsoka didn't answer immediately, lost in thought as she stared into space beyond the transparisteel. We need to debrief in person, Rex. And I needed you to talk to those troopers. Rex, the ship is yours, Kawani said as she lowered her head, motioned toward the empty pilot seat, let him pass her, and slid beside Ahsoka. She placed a hand on the Togrutta's elbow and slowly ushered her toward the hatchway, Ahsoka providing no resistance. We'll be in the aft hold, meditating. Pride swelling within that she pulled that off without sounding completely disinterested. Rex shrugged, dropped himself into the pilot seat, and set coordinates into the navicomputer for Iskalan, flipping the shipboard's comm switch, and we're off, he said, giving the women a moment to brace themselves. With a crack, the stars elongated, and the Liberator shot from Rada into hyperspace. He watched the star lines for a few minutes before retrieving the blade from his vest pocket. Turning it over in hand, he noted the difference between the rust that had shed itself after Ahsoka had thrust it into the ground, and the thicker layers that remained toward the rear of the tool. Getting up from the seat, he took a few steps toward the tool cabinet at the rear of the cockpit and retrieved a small container of thick oil and a scouring pad. Sitting at a small work desk adjacent to the cabinet, he dipped the pad into the oil and began working the abrasives into the rusty metal. Appearances indeed, he said for his benefit as he started working the oil in deeper with circular motions. Annie, I know this isn't your favorite activity, Ahsoka began as they sat facing each other on woven mats given to them by refugees from Galacta a few months ago. Although intricate in Kawani's eyes, they seemed damned appropriate. Apologies, Ahsoka. It's just been an extreme day. I am committed to my studies and understand that this is just as important as sparring, Kawani interrupted. I'm glad you said that, and that you feel that way, because you're taking the lead, Ahsoka said with a nod. Taking a lead? Kawani was baffled. I've never, I don't even know what we're trying to do this time. Her voice betrayed any confidence she may have had. That is exactly why it should be you, Annie. We've been chasing rumors with no leads to Ezra's whereabouts, and I feel I may be too involved emotionally to remain impartial to what the Force may be trying to tell us. The words came slowly and articulated. I felt our strongest link to him would have been the natural bond he had with Lothal itself. He said as much when I saw him last, or at least I thought he had. But the Force is silent for me on Lothal, and I don't understand why. Kawani could not help but feel empathy for her. She had never spoken to her like this before, revealing a weakness. She knew Ahsoka was losing patience with the search, despite her earliest recollections of the Togruta committing fully to her promise to the young man. She felt terrible for her, wanting to see the weight of emotions and pain finally recede from Ahsoka. As Kawani had been almost literally attached to her, she had seen nothing but mission after mission, pleas for help, her unresolved emotional turmoil from Mustafar's events, or even Malachor, after she had shared that in its detail some time ago. She understood precisely why Ahsoka was asking her to take the lead now. A change in perspective may lead them to the purpose they both wish desperately to fulfill. What does Zar think? Kawani asked, curious over her lack of comments regarding him, despite knowing the inhabiting spirit was anything but silent. Nothing, Ahsoka said. He has been preoccupied, it seems, because of a lack of a better way to describe the silence. She had thought it odd, but decided to let him be for now. Struggles in the physical realm don't always end in the physical realm, Annie. There are many secrets within the Force itself. Ahsoka paused as the admission so readily on her tongue felt heavy, foreboding. Secrets that it doesn't readily share. Kawani stared into Ahsoka's eyes, sensing the sincerity of her words. The internal doubt that Togruta was beginning to wear like a pair of gloves, and the guilt she was stockpiling over failed attempts to answer her questions. Kawani thought, "I think I know where to begin then, Master," she said, crossing her legs before her, straightening her back, and giving Ahsoka a sly wink before closing her eyes.